The grand chamber of the Galactic Council Station was filled with tension as representatives from 47 different alien species watched the human delegation prepare to leave. Ambassador Daniel Ross stood at the negotiation table with his jaw tight and his hands moving quickly as he gathered data tablets and documents. His eyes showed the kind of determination that came from months of frustration. Finally reaching a breaking point, Lieutenant Commander Lisa Grant stood beside him, keeping her face calm even though anyone who knew her could see the anger in her eyes. She had been part of this mission from the beginning and had watched 6 months of travel time and 5 months of negotiations lead to absolutely nothing. The Council had wasted their time, and now they expected humans to just accept whatever decision they made. The Velkari representative was a tall being made of something that looked like living crystal, and when the station lights hit its body, it created rainbow patterns across the walls. It raised one of its forearms in a gesture that was supposed to look peaceful, but Daniel knew better. These aliens had been playing games with humanity for months, and he was done. With all of it, the Velkari spoke with a voice that sounded like wind chimes, but the translation system in Daniel's ear made it sound calm and reasonable. The aliens said that surely they could find some middle ground and reminded everyone that humans had only been part of the galactic community for 30 years. It claimed that the territorial adjustments they were demanding were just standard procedure that every species had to go through. Daniel turned slowly to face the Velkari, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but everyone in the chamber could hear the edge in it. He said that standard procedure was an interesting way to describe asking humanity to surrender 7 colony worlds that humans had spent decades terraforming and building. These were worlds where human children had been born and where families had built homes and lives. He asked how that could possibly be considered a middle ground. The Thashan delegate was a reptilian creature whose scales rippled and changed color when it got agitated, and right now those scales were moving fast. It made a hissing sound and said that those worlds fell within something called the buffer zone that the Council had established 200 years ago. The Thashan claimed that human expansion into that region had been premature and done without proper authorization. Lisa stepped forward, and her tone was sharp as a knife when she asked who exactly was supposed to have authorized anything. She pointed out that humans had found empty star systems with no one living in them, and had settled those systems according to the exact protocols that the Council had given them when humanity first joined. Nobody had objected for 25 years, and no complaints had been filed, until the Velkari decided they wanted to expand in that same direction. The chamber exploded with noise as aliens from dozens of species started arguing all at once. The translation system struggled to keep up with so many different languages being spoken at the same time, and the result was a confusing mess of overlapping voices. Some species seemed to agree with the humans, while others were clearly on the Council's side, and a few seemed to just be confused about what was happening. The Council arbiter was a being of pure energy that lived inside a crystalline sphere, and it pulsed with an amber light that was the signal for everyone to be quiet. The voice that came from the sphere seemed to come from everywhere at once, and it stated that the matter was clear under Council law. The arbiter said that the buffer zone agreements were older than humanity's membership in the Council, and therefore the settlements had to be evacuated within one standard cycle, which was about 14 Earth months. Daniel picked up the last of his materials and looked directly at the floating sphere. He said that humanity's position was equally clear, and that humans would not abandon their own citizens. He stated that if the Council could not recognize the legitimacy of settlements that had been established in good faith, then perhaps humanity had no place in this Council at all. Wave of shock passed through the assembled delegates like a physical force. Some aliens made sounds of surprise, while others went completely still in whatever way their species showed shock. In 3,000 years of Council history, no member species had ever chosen to leave voluntarily. Species had been expelled for breaking laws, and some had been destroyed in wars, but none had ever just walked away. The Velkari's crystalline features seemed to grow darker, and its voice lost some of that false friendliness when it said that humans could not simply leave the galactic community. It reminded Daniel that there were treaties and trade agreements and mutual defense pacts that bound humanity to the Council. The alien claimed that leaving would mean isolation and vulnerability for the human species. Daniel looked at the Valkyrie for a long moment before responding. He said that humanity had been isolated before and pointed out that humans had survived quite well for millions of years before meeting any alien species. His voice was quiet but completely firm when he said that humanity would manage just fine without the Council. He turned to face his delegation, which consisted of 14 humans representing various aspects of Earth's unified government. These were diplomats and military officers and trade specialists who had all given months of their lives to try and make this work. Daniel told them to pack everything because they were leaving within the hour. As the humans began moving toward the exit, the Thashan delegate called out with a voice that dripped with contempt. It said that this was exactly the kind of impulsive behavior you could expect from a young species. The alien asked if humans were really going to throw away everything over 7 minor worlds and pointed out that the human economy depended on Council trade routes. It claimed that human defenses were integrated with Council peacekeeping forces and said that humans needed the Council far more than the Council needed humanity. Daniel stopped at the doorway without turning around at first. Then he looked back one final time, and his eyes moved across the chamber, taking in all the alien faces and forms. He said that perhaps the Thashan was right, but there was something that all these aliens needed to understand about humans. He explained that humanity had built civilizations from nothing before and had overcome solved extinction events and ice ages and wars that nearly destroyed their own world. Daniel stated that humans had learned a long time ago that freedom and dignity were not things you could negotiate away no matter what the cost might be. The door sealed behind the human delegation with a soft hiss, leaving the Council chamber in complete silence. 47 species sat or stood or floated in their positions, trying to process what had just happened. The Valkyrie representative looked at the Arbiter and asked what they should do now, but the sphere of energy just pulsed with an uncertain yellow color. Nobody had a plan for this, because nothing like this had ever happened before in the entire history of the Galactic Council. The human transport ship Endeavor pulled away from the Council station with its massive engines, creating waves of distorted space as it accelerated toward the nearest warp point. Inside the ship's main conference room, Daniel sat with his senior staff, and the weight of their decision was settling over all of them like a heavy blanket. That made everything feel more serious, and Riel, Lieutenant Kyle Morrison, was a young officer who had been handling communications throughout the entire negotiation process, and now he looked up from his console with wide eyes. He reported that Earth Command was requesting immediate communication using their highest priority encryption, which meant that everyone back home was watching and waiting for answers. Daniel nodded and told Kyle to put them through. The holographic display in the center of the conference table flickered to life, and suddenly they were looking at President Helen Crawford sitting in the Situation Room deep beneath the Capitol building. Her face was hard to read, and she was surrounded by advisors and military chiefs whose expressions ranged from worried to grim to outright angry. The president began, speaking in a measured tone that gave nothing away about what she was really thinking. She said that she had received Daniel's preliminary report and that the entire council was now demanding that humanity reverse its position. She mentioned that the Valkyrie had already threatened trade sanctions, and then she asked the question that everyone was thinking. She wanted to know if Daniel was certain that this was the right path for humanity to take. Daniel leaned forward with his hands clasped on the table in front of him. He said that he knew how this looked and that he understood the concerns, but that backing down now would set a terrible precedent. He explained that if humans showed weakness at this moment, then every time the Council wanted something in the future, they would know. They just had to push hard enough, and humanity would fold. He said that their colonies and trade routes and sovereignty would all become negotiable if they gave in now. General Nathan Pierce was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and he appeared in the hologram beside the president, looking every bit the career military officer. He said that they had run all the scenarios, and the numbers were not good. The general explained that if humanity withdrew from the council, they would lose access to 70% of established trade routes. He pointed out that human colonies outside council space would become vulnerable to piracy and territorial disputes with species that were not council members. He stated that the economic impact alone could trigger a serious recession. Lisa spoke up with respect in her voice, but firmness in her words. She said that those were short-term problems, and asked what the long-term cost would be of teaching the entire galaxy that humanity could be pushed around. She asked what it would mean for the future if humans showed that their word meant nothing when it came to protecting their own people. The president was silent for a long moment, and her fingers drummed softly on the table in a rhythm that showed she was thinking hard. She said that she had been in politics for 30 years, and had learned that sometimes the appearance of strength mattered just as much as actual strength. She admitted that she had also learned that you could never negotiate from a position of weakness. The president stated that if they showed the council they were afraid of the consequences, then humanity would never be treated as equals in that chamber. She straightened in her chair, and her decision was clear in her eyes when she told Daniel to proceed with the withdrawal. She said she would address the United Nations Assembly within the hour, and that Earth would begin immediate preparations for economic independence and enhanced security measures for all human colonies. Daniel said there was one more thing that the president needed to know. He explained that during the final session, the Valkyrie representative had made an interesting comment about human defenses being integrated with council peacekeeping forces. Daniel said he had asked their security team to audit exactly what that integration actually meant and what access the council had to human systems. General Pierce's expression darkened, and he asked if Daniel thought the council had access to their defensive networks. Daniel replied that he thought they needed to know exactly what humanity had shared with the council under all these mutual defense agreements, and that they needed to know before they were completely cut off from council systems. The president nodded sharply and told the general to make it his top priority. She said that if there were any backdoors or access points in human defensive infrastructure, she wanted them found and closed immediately. She stated that humanity might be leaving the council, but they were not going to leave themselves vulnerable to attack or manipulation. The communication ended, and Daniel and his team were left in the quiet hum of the ship's systems. Kyle looked up from his console with a troubled expression on his young face. He said they were receiving messages from several council species, but these were not official communications. He explained that these were personal messages from scientists that humans had worked with and trade partners they had done business with, and even some military officers from other species. Kyle said these aliens were expressing regret, and some were even saying they wished their own governments had the courage to stand up to the council's bureaucracy the way humans had. Lisa raised an eyebrow and asked if that meant the council was not as unified as they pretended to be. Daniel said that maybe it was not unified at all, and pointed out that the council had existed for 3,000 years. He said that was a very long time for resentments to build up and for smaller species to feel overshadowed by the major powers. Daniel suggested that humanity might not be the only ones who were frustrated with the way things worked. Lisa said that could work in their favor, suggested that if they could establish direct relationships with individual species outside the council framework, then maybe humanity would not be as isolated as the Valkyrie thought they would be. Daniel stood and walked to the viewport where the stars were stretching into long lines as the Endeavor jumped to warp speed. He said that was exactly what he was hoping for, and that the council thought they were punishing humanity by forcing them out. He suggested that what the council might not realize was that they were actually freeing humanity from a system that had been holding them back all along. He turned back to face his team, and a slight smile crossed his face. Daniel said that by this time next year he wanted humanity to have independent trade agreements with at least 20 different species. He said he wanted their own protected shipping lanes, and wanted human colonies defended by human ships using human technology. Daniel stated that if the council wanted humanity back, it would have to come to the humans, and they would have to come with respect and treat humanity as equals. 3 months had passed since humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, and the consequences were both worse and better than anyone had expected. In the port city of Nova Seattle on the colony world of Aurora, Prime Governor Chris Bennett stood at his office window watching cargo ships lift off from the spaceport, carrying the last shipments that were still bound for Council trade routes. The economic disruption had been immediate and harsh in ways that hurt real people in their daily lives. Unemployment had jumped up fast as galactic corporations closed their human branches, and the price of imported goods had tripled overnight, making life harder for ordinary families. But something unexpected was happening at the same time, and it was something that gave Chris hope for the first time in months. His economic advisor, Margaret Cole, rushed into his office, clutching a datapad in her hand and practically shaking with excitement. She told him he needed to see something right away and held out the pad for him to read. Chris took the device and scanned the message. Quickly, while his eyebrows climbed higher on his forehead, he said out loud that the Sorvin Merchant Collective wanted to negotiate a direct trade agreement with Aurora Prime. He pointed out that the Sorvin were a council member species and asked how this was even possible. Margaret could barely contain her excitement when she explained that technically, yes, the Sorvin were council members, but that their merchant collective operated with a lot of independence from their main government. She said they were offering to purchase all of Aurora Prime's agricultural output at 15% above what council market rates had been. She added that there would be no tariffs and no bureaucratic approval process, and that the Sorvin were willing to sign a 20-year contract right now. Chris leaned back in his chair and a slow smile spread across his face. He asked if he was correct in guessing that the Sorvin were tired of the council's trade regulations eating into their profit margins. Margaret said that was exactly right, and then dropped an even bigger surprise. She told him that the Sorvin were not the only ones, and that they had received similar inquiries from 3 other species in just the past week. She explained that the council's bureaucracy made everything expensive and slow, but now that humans were outside their system, they could negotiate directly and set their own terms and move faster than the council had ever allowed them to move. Meanwhile, in the orbital shipyards high above Earth, Admiral Gregory Hayes stood on the observation deck of the largest construction facility humanity had ever built. He was watching as the framework of humanity's first truly independent battlecruiser took shape in the construction bay. The ship was enormous and dwarfed anything humans had built before, and it was being designed without compromise or committee oversight. Using human specifications rather than council standards, Captain Nicole Stevens stood beside the Admiral, and she would be commanding this vessel once it was complete. She said quietly that the ship was beautiful and asked how long it would be until completion. Gregory replied that if the construction crews maintained their current pace, they were looking at 8 months. He told her they were calling the ship Independence, which seemed appropriate given everything that had happened. Nicole studied the technical readouts on her tablet and said the design was impressive. She noted that it had more firepower than a standard council peacekeeping vessel and better shields, and that the new propulsion system engineers had been developing was finally being put to use. She said the council had never let humans build ships like this one. Gregory said bluntly that the council had been afraid of what humans might do with real warships. He stated that the council had been holding humanity back for years, and they smiled and called humans partners, but they had really been treating humanity like children who needed constant supervision. He said that humans did not need the council's permission. Any more back on the council station? The ramifications of humanity's withdrawal were causing upheaval that had not been seen in centuries. The Velkar representative stood before the full council assembly, and his crystalline features were reflecting agitation in every color. He announced that the humans had begun negotiating independent trade agreements with 17 council member species. He said this was in direct violation of council trade protocols and demanded that these species should be sanctioned immediately. The Thashan delegate rose to speak, but his tone was more cautious than it had been during the failed peace talks months ago. He said that sanctioning 17 species would destabilize the entire council economy and suggested that perhaps they should consider a diplomatic outreach to the humans instead. He proposed inviting humanity back to negotiations. The Valkyrie representative snapped back that this was absolutely not acceptable. He said that showing any flexibility would demonstrate weakness. and that other species would think they could simply walk away whenever a council decision did not favor them. But murmurs were spreading through the chamber like fire through dry grass. The smaller species, who had always felt overshadowed by the council's major powers, were watching humanity's bold experiment with growing interest. If the humans could thrive outside the council system, then what did that say about the actual value of council membership? The arbiter pulsed with a concerned amber. Lighton stated that this situation was unprecedented. It said that, in 3,000 years, they had never faced voluntary withdrawal by a member species, and that the economic and political implications were deeply troubling. In a private meeting chamber far away from the main council floor, 5 representatives from smaller species met in secret where no one could observe them. The Curulon delegate was a being that resembled an earth octopus, but adapted for life and standard atmosphere, and it spoke in hushed tones that would not carry beyond their small group. It said that the humans were proving something that many of them had suspected for decades. The Curulon stated that the council was not indispensable, and pointed out that humanity was thriving and building their own trade networks and developing their own military capabilities, all without council oversight or approval. The Meraxian representative was an insectoid being whose compound eyes glittered with interest in the dim light. It added that humans were also thriving without council interference, and noted that its own government had been trying to reform the council's trade bureaucracy for 50 years. The Meraxian said that the humans had simply bypassed the entire system. Another delegate asked carefully what exactly they were suggesting. The Curulon replied that it was suggesting they all watch very carefully what happened next. It said that if humanity succeeded in their independence, then they might have shown everyone a path forward. The Curulon pointed out that the council was meant to be a cooperative organization, but somewhere along the way it had become a hierarchy where the major powers made all the rules and everyone else just followed orders. The Meraxian said quietly that they could do what the humans did and build their own partnerships and chart their own course. The meeting ended with nothing officially decided, but seeds of an idea had been planted in the minds of these representatives. These were seeds that would grow in ways the council's leaders could never have anticipated, and would change the balance of power in the galaxy. 6 months after the withdrawal came the real test that would prove whether humanity could truly survive on their own. The distress signal reached Earth's command at 3 in the morning, and within minutes, Admiral Gregory Hayes was in the command center, still fastening his uniform jacket as he rushed through the door. On the main display screen, a desperate message was playing on repeat over and over again. The voice was breaking with fear and static as it said this was Colony 7 on Horizon's Edge and that they were under attack by unknown forces. The message stated there were 3 ships and that they were heavily armed and that the colony's orbital defenses were failing. The voice begged for immediate assistance before the transmission cut out and started repeating from the beginning. Captain Nicole Stevens appeared on the communication channel from the newly commissioned Independence, and her face was calm, but her eyes showed she was ready for action. She said that they could reach Horizon's Edge in 48 hours if they pushed the engines hard, but she pointed out that the colony was right on the border of council space. She said that if they responded, they would be operating in a politically sensitive area. Gregory's jaw tightened, and his voice was firm when he said that those were human colonists under attack. He stated that there were 2,000 men and women and children on that colony, and that they were not going to sit around debating politics while people were dying. He said the Independence was authorized to respond with all necessary force, and that he was dispatching the Roosevelt and the Liberty to provide support. Nicole said she understood and that the Independence was already underway. The massive ship's engines flared to life, and it jumped to warp speed, heading toward the distant colony at maximum velocity. On the council station, alarms were sounding throughout the facility. The attack on Horizon's Edge had been detected by council monitoring systems, and the response among the member species was immediate chaos. The Valkyrie representative convened an emergency session, and species Representatives rushed to the chamber from all over the station. The Valkyrie's voice was sharp when it announced that the colony under attack was in a disputed border region. It stated that the Council could not allow humanity to conduct military operations in that area without Council oversight. The Valkyrie claimed that it could set a dangerous precedent if humans were allowed to operate independently. But the Arbiter's response was not what anyone expected. The sphere of energy pulsed with a steady blue light as it stated that the attacked colony was clearly identified as a human settlement. It said that under interstellar law, humans had the right to self-defense and the right to call for assistance from their own government. The Arbiter made it clear that the Council had no legal standing to prevent a rescue operation. The Thashan delegate demanded to know what would happen if the humans used this as an excuse to establish a military presence in that sector. Its scales rippled with agitation as it spoke about the potential for human expansion. A new voice cut through the chamber, and it belonged to the Curulon delegate. The octopus-like being said that perhaps they should have considered these possibilities before they tried to force humans to abandon their colonies. It stated that the Council had created this situation and that the humans had asked for Council protection, but were told to surrender their worlds instead. The Curulon said that now humans were protecting themselves as any species would and should. Meraxian delegate added its support and moved that the Council send an observer ship to monitor the situation but take no action to interfere with the human rescue operation. It argued that if they tried to stop humans from defending their own people, they would only prove that humanity had been right to leave the Council. After heated debate that lasted for hours, the motion passed by a narrow margin. But the Council's major powers were clearly not pleased with the outcome, and the Valkyrie representatives stormed out of the chamber in anger. The Independence dropped out of warp at the edge of the Horizon's Edge system, and its sensors immediately began painting a picture of the battle. 3 large vessels with designs that did not match anything in human databases were hammering the colony's orbital platforms with sustained weapons fire. Explosions bloomed in the darkness as defensive stations were torn apart. Nicole broadcast on all frequencies. With her voice calm and professional, she identified herself as Captain Nicole Stevens of the Earth's Defense Ship Independence, and stated that the attacking vessels were firing on a human colony. She ordered them to cease fire immediately and withdraw or face a forceful response. The response from the unknown ships was a weapons lock as all 3 vessels turned toward the Independence and prepared to fire. Nicole looked at her tactical officer and said calmly that the attackers had made their choice. She authorized engagement and told her crew to show these pirates what a real warship could do. The Independence had been built without any constraints from Council regulations, and it incorporated every piece of technology and tactical doctrine that humanity had developed over decades. The shields flared bright as enemy fire struck them, but the defensive systems held firm without buckling. The return fire from the Independence was devastating and precise. Railgun strikes punched through enemy shields like they were made of paper and ripped into hull plating with catastrophic results. The battle was short and brutal in the way that modern space combat always was. Within 15 minutes, 2 of the attacking ships were disabled and drifting in space with their engines dead and life support failing. The 3rd ship attempted to flee, and its captain must have realized too late that they had made a terrible mistake. The Independence pursued the fleeing vessel and matched its speed easily with the advanced human drives. The enemy ship twisted and turned, trying to escape, but it was like a mouse trying to outrun a hawk. Nicole's communications officer reported that they were receiving a transmission from the fleeing vessel and that the attackers were transmitting surrender codes and requesting mercy. Nicole considered for a moment while watching the damaged ship on her display. She told her communications officer to inform the enemy that humanity accepted their surrender and ordered them to prepare for boarding. She said she wanted to know exactly who these attackers were and why they had thought it was acceptable to attack a human colony, as Independence Marines secured the enemy ship and began taking prisoners. Nicole opened a channel to Admiral Hayes back on Earth. She reported that the colony was secure, and that casualties on the ground had been heavy, but that they had stopped the attack before the enemy could land troops. She said they had captured the attacking forces and were beginning interrogation. Gregory's voice came back with approval and pride evident in his tone. He said that the council had been monitoring the entire situation and that they were now requesting permission to send an observer to interview the prisoners. Nicole's expression hardened, and she said with respect that these pirates had attacked a human colony and were therefore human prisoners. She stated that this was a human investigation, and that if the council wanted information, they could file a formal request through diplomatic channels, when humanity decided to reopen diplomatic relations. Gregory smiled and said those were his thoughts exactly. He told Nicole to proceed with interrogation and to find out who was behind the attack. He said they needed to make sure that everyone in the galaxy understood that human colonies were now protected by human forces, and that no hostile permission was required or desired. 1 year after humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, Ambassador Daniel Ross stood in a very different kind of chamber. Instead of the imposing grandeur of the council station, he was in a modest conference facility on the neutral world of Meridian Prime, surrounded by representatives from 23 different species. None of them were speaking for the council, and that was the most important thing. They were here as independent governments, ready to negotiate with humanity on equal terms. Daniel stood at the front of the room with holographic displays showing shipping routes and economic projections floating in the air around him. He explained that the trade agreement framework humanity was proposing was straightforward and simple. He said it would mean open markets with minimal tariffs and mutual protection of merchant vessels. He emphasized that there would be no bureaucracy, and no committees and no waiting years for approval of simple contracts. He said it would just be honest trade between sovereign species who respected each other. The Sorvan representative was a veteran merchant named Kellex who had been trading for decades and knew the value of a good deal. Kellex rippled with approval. In the way his species showed pleasure and said that the Sorvan collective had prospered greatly from their agreement with humanity. He stated that their profit margins had increased by 40% without council overhead costs eating into their earnings. He said enthusiastically that the Sorvans supported this expanded framework. The Meraxian delegate added that their government agreed completely. It said that they had found that direct negotiations with humanity were far more efficient than working through council channels. The insectoid being asked why any of them should pay tribute to a bureaucracy that only served to slow everything down and make trade more expensive. But the Curulon delegate raised a tentacle in a gesture of caution. It said that they all needed to consider the political implications carefully. The Curulon pointed out that the council would view this alliance as a direct challenge to their authority. It warned that the major powers might respond with sanctions or even military pressure against species that joined. Daniel nodded because the concern was valid, and he had expected someone to raise it. He said that was exactly why this was not just a trade agreement, but also a mutual defense pact. He explained that any member species that faced retaliation from the council or any other power would have the support of all other members. He stated that together they represented a significant portion of the galaxy's economic and military capability. Admiral Gregory Hayes appeared via holographic link, and his presence added weight to Daniel's words. The Admiral said that the human defense fleet was now fully operational with 12 battlecruisers and 40 destroyers and 100 support vessels. He stated that all of these ships had been built to human specifications and were crewed by trained personnel. He made it clear that humanity was not seeking conflict, but that they were prepared to defend their friends as well as themselves. The weight of that statement settled over the assembly like a physical presence. Humanity had gone from being a junior member of the council to an independent power with its own fleet and its own trade network and its own allies in just 1 year. The transformation was remarkable, and every species in the room understood what it meant. On the council station, implications were impossible to ignore anymore. In an emergency session, the Valkyrie representative stood with his crystalline features dark with anger. He announced that the humans had formed a rival coalition and that 23 species, including many council members, had essentially created a parallel government. He said this was exactly what the council had feared would happen. But the arbiter's response surprised everyone in the chamber. The sphere of energy pulsed with an unusual crimson color that indicated frustration. It asked what they had feared or what they had caused. The Arbiter said that they needed to be honest for once and stated that the Council had become stagnant over the centuries. It pointed out that the major powers had controlled policy for so long, while smaller species had no real voice. The Arbiter said that humanity had simply shown these smaller species that there was another way. The Thashan delegate hissed in frustration and asked what the Arbiter proposed they do. It asked if they should simply accept this fragmentation of the galactic community. The Arbiter said that it proposed they learn from what had happened. It stated that humanity left because the Council tried to treat them as subordinates rather than equals. It said that other species were following humanity for the same reason, because they were tired of being treated as lesser members. The Arbiter declared that if the Council wanted to remain relevant, it had to reform. It said they needed to give member species real representation and reduce bureaucratic oversight and make membership beneficial rather than burdensome. The Valkyrie representative demanded to know what would happen if they did not reform. The Arbiter replied that the Council would continue to lose members until only the major powers remained ruling over an empire of their own making. It said they would be left wondering where everyone else went. The debate continued for months after that, but change was now inevitable. Galaxy had been shown that alternatives existed to the Council's 3,000-year-old system, and species were taking note. On Earth, President Helen Crawford addressed a joint session of the United Nations Assembly, and her words were broadcast across all human worlds. She said that 1 year ago, humanity made a decision that terrified many people. She stated that they walked away from the only galactic government they had ever known and risked isolation, an economic collapse, and vulnerability. She said that today she stood before them to report that humanity was thriving. The President announced that the human economy had grown by 22%. And that their colonies were more secure than ever before, defended by their own fleets. She said they had established meaningful partnerships with species across the galaxy built on mutual respect rather than bureaucratic hierarchy. She stated that humanity had proven something important, not just to themselves, but to the entire galaxy. She said they proved that strength comes not from bending to others' demands, but from standing firm in your principles. The President said that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from a bad deal, even when everyone tells you that you cannot survive without it. She stated that the Galactic Council wanted to make an example of humanity and show the galaxy what happens when you defy their authority. She said that, instead, humanity showed the galaxy what was possible when you refused to be anyone's subordinate. She declared that they showed the galaxy that freedom and dignity were worth fighting for, and worth sacrificing for, and worth risking everything for. She announced the formation of the Free Species Alliance, which would be a coalition of independent governments committed to cooperation without coercion and trade, without tribute and mutual defense, without surrender of sovereignty. She invited all species who shared these values to join not as subordinates or overlords, but as equals. In the conference facility on Meridian, Prime Daniel watched the President's address alongside representatives from dozens of worlds. As the speech ended, the chamber erupted in applause, which was a sound rarely heard in galactic politics. Kellex, the Sorvan merchant, approached Daniel with something that might have been a smile on his alien features. He said that humans had a saying about doors closing and windows opening. Daniel smiled back and said that when one door closes, another opens, but that he preferred the version that said, if a door closes, you should kick it down and walk through anyway. Kellex observed that this was very human. He said that the Council thought they were punishing humanity by forcing them out, but instead they freed humans to become what they were always meant to be. He said that now many species were joining humanity in that freedom. Lisa approached holding a datapad with new messages. She told Daniel that they were receiving requests for alliance membership from 6 more species. She said there was also an unofficial communication from the Arbiter itself, asking if humanity would be willing to send an advisor to help the Council reform its structure. She said the Council wanted to learn from what humans had built. Daniel laughed with genuine surprise. He asked if the Council really wanted humans to teach them how to run their organization. Lisa said that apparently walking away was the most powerful negotiating tactic they had. She said the